Let's talk about the House passing the votes. At any point, I guess, in this stalemate, were you sweating about default?
Sure, absolutely. I think everybody probably, while publicly was saying the US will reach an agreement because that's the only thing that makes sense. I think as the deadline got closer, I'm sure all of us were getting increasingly nervous because, let's face it, when you have significant economic downturns and very weak recoveries, they do strange things to politics. But look, we have some type of agreement, and that can be said, it's good news.
Okay, well, let's talk about the reaction in the currency markets, because yesterday when we had U.S. President Obama saying we had a deal in Washington, we saw some big moves in the Japanese currency, in particular, weakness of over 1%. What is the currency markets telling us right now about this deal?
I don't think it's necessarily about the deal. It's partly about that. I think currency markets are still telling you the dollar's a very, very weak currency, and it really can't rally under any good news. I think if we hadn't reached an agreement, we might have been able to get a dollar squeeze, or if we'd had an agreement which very clearly satisfied the rating agencies, i.e. we got the magic $4 trillion number, I think they may have seen the dollar a bit stronger. But this middle-of-the-road deal, which isn't necessarily enough to get the credit rating agencies out of the picture permanently, but also is enough to keep interest rates in the US very low, I think generally just keeps the dollar as the weakest currency.
Now, you say that, but then we saw a slight weakness, well, 1% plus weakness in the yen yesterday, but there's still, calls, I guess, for the dollar to fall below 70 to the Japanese currency. Is that insight for you? Do you think that's a possibility?
Look, they're not in my forecast, but certainly I think dollar yen is still going down. I mean, I think the equation here is very simple. With US and Japanese interest rates at similar levels, it really becomes a tussle about external balances, and Japan runs a 3% of GDP current account surplus, the US runs a 3% of GDP current account deficit. I don't think it's any more complicated than that. And with the Fed unlikely to move rates for, 6, 12 months, 18 months, whatever, I think the pressure on dollar yen is going to remain to the downside. There's very little that the Japanese can do about it. They already have interest rates at zero. The Bank of Japan already has an expanded balance sheet. They've already had 2 rounds of intervention at various points in the last 12 months, and dollar yen is still lower. I think dollar yen's going down still.
Okay, dollar yen's going down still, meaning it's going to strengthen in the future. Is that right?
Yeah, the yen will strengthen. I think 72 I've got in my forecasts.
Okay. All right. So maybe it's a good bet to buy into the yen if you can gain about 5 yen to the dollar there. Okay. So the Japanese yen sounds like it's going to be a strong currency against the U.S. dollar. What else is going to outperform?
Well, I think, obviously the emerging market story in Asia is still very strong. And there's been a little bit of dollar strength overnight, but some of the levels here are quite important. We're at 10.50 in dollar Korea, for instance. Strength for the dollar off what are very weak levels, I think, historically, but where, the economic fundamentals still seems to suggest the dollar will weaken. We had some strong CPI numbers out of Korea recently. So even though US interest rates are stuck at zero and certainly not going lower, rates elsewhere are continuing to increase.
Yeah, some are saying 10.50 is a support line for the won. Richard, now before I let you go, let's talk about what's happening in Australia, because it is rate decision day, of course, and ANZ, wow, what a call coming from, I don't know if you made the call or your colleagues did at ANZ, but they're expecting an interest rate hike at this point. What does that mean for the Australian dollar? We're seeing some strength already this morning.
Yeah, it will give the Aussie a little bit of a boost. I don't think the Australian dollar call, though, comes down to, in the big picture, calls about one interest rate hike or not. I think the equation really is that you still have a very strong mining economy in this part of the world. So I think the best case is interest rates certainly are not falling for the foreseeable future, despite what some forecasts in the market are calling for. And I think against the backdrop of where I see the US dollar, the Aussie's going to stay a very strong currency. I have 114 in my numbers for the Aussie dollar next year. The risk on that number is we get there earlier.